Please sit down. Well, good morning and warm welcome to Admiralty House this morning for the launch of a very special week in the life of NAPCAN and the associated organisations and people who work alongside it. Could I begin though by acknowledging that Admiralty House is on the land of the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation, and it's nice to be back into this part of the country. Sydney-siders know the Eora Nation sort of fits in the Sydney Basin here, and we thank them for looking after it for us for generation after generation. Pay respects to elders past and present, and mindful today for this particular audience of our responsibility to the younger generation of Aboriginal kids whose future is really critical to the future of this country. Can I acknowledge this morning we have Ms. Teresa Scott, the President of NAPCAN, and members of the board, Lisa Waters, the CEO of NAPCAN, Oliver White, the Chair of the NAPCAN Youth Advisory Council, and Oliver's mum, I'm calling him Oliver, not Ollie this morning, so distinguished guests. Thank you all for being here on what is a very important day, really an important week on our national calendar. National Child Protection Week brings really to the foreground the harms experienced by children in our country. And it's a week designated in the name of child protection, and it focuses on collective action and energy on addressing a really important issue. And everyone in this room and the organisations you represent, I know, are doing your best to promote the safety and well-being of our children. And I do thank you for your tireless efforts and your positive difference that you're making for our children. We're here today for two reasons: to acknowledge that child abuse and neglect remains a major issue in Australia today, and Ben will talk to us more about that in a moment. But most importantly, we're prepared to do something about it. So we'll hear from Ben shortly, and he was the lead investigator in the Australian Child Maltreatment Study. The study was the first national survey to establish the prevalence and nature of 5 forms of child maltreatment and their associated health outcomes. And I think the study shows 2 particular points that I note: that 6 out of 10 Australians have experienced abuse as a child, and approximately half of these are currently living with a serious mental health consequences of that. And of course, from that, families require more support to protect children from abuse and its potential impacts. These, of course, are alarming findings, and as I said, Ben will take us through a few more. And in light of the study, NAPCAN's focus this week is, of course, on what we can do to stop child abuse before it occurs, so prevention. And our theme this week, is where we start matters. And when you first read that, it's sort of where we start. You're thinking yourself, where we start in addressing that. I don't think that's the point at all. It's where we start as children really matters. The environment that we help parents and communities create for children and their upbringing is what really matters. And if we start by listening to children, and a great initiative by NAPCAN to have the Youth Council advising and speaking to it, and their families, we find out what the need is at a very basic level. Clearly more work to be done, and Ben will point to that, I believe, and I think many of you are aware of the findings of that study. But we want to invest in children and families. We want to help create safer and healthier communities now and into the future. It's a tough ask, because if it wasn't, we'd already have done it. And there are many challenges. Australians are up to it though. I've quoted Michelle Simmons so many times in a number of speeches this week in Sydney. I just love what she says. Professor Michelle Simmons was British, came out to Australia to lead our quantum computing project at University of New South Wales. Groundbreaking, world leading. She became an Australian, and you might recall she became the Australian of the Year about 3 years ago. When she was asked, why did you come to Australia? She said, because Australians aren't afraid of taking on the big challenges. I sometimes think we forget that, what's in our national character and our heritage and what we bring to issues. And I think that comment applies particularly to this one. Not afraid to take on the big challenges. So in Michelle's footsteps, let's follow and take on a big challenge, and of course with big hearts. If there's anything that makes me optimistic about Australia, is the people we see on a daily basis with enormous hearts for community. And that's so important. And again, we should look ourselves in the mirror every time, now and again, and say we're actually good people and we can work hard on this. So I encourage you all and all Australians who might be listening and watching at the moment to get behind National Child Protection Week. It's a responsibility that we as a society need to prioritise, and our children deserve the opportunities to thrive and be their best. It's one opportunity this week for all Australians to learn how to play a part in promoting the well-being of our children. There'll be a number of webinars this week to be held over, and again, I encourage people to get involved, and you can go to the NAPCAM website for the details of those. Again, I want to express with Linda a heartfelt thank you to all of you for what you do, the organisations you represent. You're very good people. This is an extremely challenging sector, requires a range of skill sets and compassion, judgment, patience, that relationship building with children, which is so critical in their lives. So please keep at it. Your work is critically important. And we look forward in our relationship with NAPCAM. I think we've got one more year of it. So everything that we can do to help you, please come and ask. And we need our children to be growing up in a society that values them and says it's so critical that you have a happy, formative, positive growing up experience, because it's cliche to say, but you are our future. So thank you.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Cammeraygal peoples as the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. I acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. I've visited here today and come to you from the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples in Meanjin. Your Excellencies, thank you very much for hosting us here today. And His Excellency, I echo your statements this morning. These are very large, complex issues, but we can indeed do something about it. Thank you for hosting us in this beautiful venue. To distinguished guests, to policymakers and sector leaders, and to fellow Australians today. It's a privilege for me to deliver this keynote address for National Child Protection Week. Today, I will be sharing some sobering findings from our Australian Child Maltreatment Study, which some of you may already know is a pioneering 5-year project in which we've discovered for the first time the true prevalence of each of the 5 types of child maltreatment and their associated mental health outcomes and health risk behaviours right through life. Before I do, I want to pose some questions for us to consider. Who are we as a nation? Who do we want to be? In 10, 20, 30 and 40 years' time, will we be able to look back on our work, on our choices, and say that the things we have done now have made our country a better place, a fairer place, a place where children are less likely to experience abuse, a place where there is less pain and suffering, a place where children have a better chance of living the best life they can, and a place where our children, families and communities thrive. These questions are so important for governments at the Australian national level and at the state and territory level. These are important personal and professional questions for our political leaders. These questions are about our values. They're about what we really recognise as being most important in life, and they're about our legacy as leaders and as human beings. Now, these questions are worth contemplating not just today in Child Protection Week. They demand our attention and our action in coming weeks, months, years and decades. This is a long-term, long-haul commitment. We have a responsibility to each other and to those of us who are most vulnerable. This is a responsibility from which we must not shrink. And so, in this study, we surveyed 8,500 Australians to identify the percentage of children who experience physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, and exposure to domestic violence. And we also identified these outcomes, these experiences and their outcomes for mental health, things like depression, anxiety, alcohol use disorder, and health risk behaviours, things like self-harm, suicide attempt, cannabis dependence, serious, debilitating outcomes. This, finally, is the evidence that we need to inform targeted public health prevention strategies to better protect our nation's children, to prevent child maltreatment even before it begins, and to reduce the devastating consequences of maltreatment both in childhood and throughout life for kids, adolescents, adults, families, and communities, and also for the nation. Mental disorders and suicide cause untold cost to this great country, costing $200 to $220 billion per annum. And we've found child maltreatment contributes substantially to that cost. So even from a crude economic standpoint, this must be a national priority. Now, leading worldwide scholars have concluded that child maltreatment is the single biggest preventable risk factor for mental conditions through life. We've identified this same pattern in our study, but the key word here is preventable. Child maltreatment is preventable if we do the right things, if we make the right choices, and if we have the right values. So what did we find? First, let me reassure you just how rigorous this project was. It took years of preparatory work even before we began, done by an international team of leading researchers, and it represents gold standard science for the international field. Part of this rigor involved making sure we measured things that really were child maltreatment, serious experiences that we're talking about, not just trivial or minor things or less than ideal parenting. So let me give you a few examples of the acts we're talking about and how severe they are. For physical abuse, we asked people if, before they were age 18, their parent had ever hit them, punched them, kicked them, or physically hurt them. We also asked if they'd ever been beaten up by their parent or hit on the head or face, or choked or burned. That's physical abuse. For emotional abuse, we asked people if their parent had, over a period of weeks, months, or years, experienced verbal hostility, so being insulted, humiliated, or called hurtful names. We asked about outright rejection, so their parent telling them they didn't love them, wished they'd never been born, hated them, or wished they were dead. 8.8% of Australian kids have had that experience. For sexual abuse, we asked 4 questions about different experiences, including 3 types of contact sexual abuse, right up to forced sex. That's rape. 8.7% of kids in Australia have experienced rape. Exposure to domestic violence, we asked about witnessing acts between parents, including physical assaults, serious threats of physical assaults, property damage, and coercive control. Tough things to ask about, tougher things to experience. So what did we find? We found child maltreatment is widespread. 32% of Australians have experienced physical abuse in childhood, 28.5% sexual abuse, 30.9% emotional abuse, 8.9% neglect, and 39.6% exposure to domestic violence. Nearly 1 in 4 children have experienced 3 to 5 types of child maltreatment, multi-type maltreatment. Lots of kids in Australia have a tough time in childhood. There's also a gendered pattern here. there's a gendered disparity, especially for sexual abuse, where girls experience twice as much sexual abuse as boys and about 1.5 times as much emotional abuse as boys. We have a problem with violence against children, but we also have a problem with gendered violence against children. We also found that child maltreatment is not something that just happened in the past in Australia. This is not just something from the 1960s, it's happening now. So from our sample of 8,500 Australians, we had 3,500 people who were aged 16 to 24. It gives us really strong evidence about relatively recent contemporary times and the experience of maltreatment today. Some forms of maltreatment have declined a bit. I'll talk about that in a moment. That gives us hope. But some forms are even more common now than they used to be in former times. Emotional abuse in particular is more frequent now than it used to be. That's important because emotional abuse is very, very damaging for mental health and health risk behaviours. We found that child maltreatment is associated with severe mental health problems and behavioural harms through life. And when we measured mental health, we didn't just ask about self-reported symptoms, we administered a clinically diagnostic instrument. This is very, very robust data. Basically, as His Excellency said, about half of people who experienced any maltreatment met the criteria for one of the 4 clinically diagnostic mental disorders that we measured: PTSD, alcohol use disorder, depression, and generalised anxiety disorder. Half. Equally, that means half didn't. So there's some really resilient Australians out there and people who've got the support of other protective factors. We can learn from that too. So you're not predestined to these outcomes if you experience maltreatment, but you are about 2.8 times more likely to experience them. To give you an idea, 3 times more likely to experience depression and anxiety, 2.6 times more likely to have severe alcohol use disorder, 4.6 times more likely to have post-traumatic stress disorder. These are debilitating conditions. Equally, for health risk behaviours, if you experienced child maltreatment, you are 6 times as likely as those who don't to be dependent on cannabis, 4.5 times more likely to have attempted suicide, and 4 times more likely to have self-harmed. Now, another really important point we found is that these terrible outcomes happen quickly. They have a rapid onset. They don't just lay dormant until your 30s or 40s, they happen in adolescence. Okay, so the 16 to 24-year-olds from our survey, they gave us this information. So 16 to 24-year-olds, 2.9 times more likely to have a mental disorder if they experience maltreatment than those who did not. Pretty much 3 times, triple. Okay, these are really, really significant likelihoods of experiencing mental disorders from maltreatment. Similarly, health risk behaviours in adolescents aged 16 to 24. Let me give you these statistics that really bring it home so starkly. Of 16 to 24-year-olds who experienced any maltreatment, 5.9% of them were dependent on cannabis. 0.6% of those who did not experience maltreatment were. So you can see there the dramatic difference that child maltreatment makes. For those who experienced child maltreatment aged 16 to 24 in our survey, 14.3% had inflicted self-harm in the prior year. Their counterparts who did not experience maltreatment, only 3% had. Similarly, 5.2% of those maltreated had attempted suicide in the prior year. These are people aged 16 to 24. Those who did not experience maltreatment, only 0.6%. Massive, massive differences. This is the impact of child maltreatment in the teenage years and the early 20s, really crucial stages of life. Now, one thing I really want you to remember is that we measured all 5 types of child maltreatment and they're all damaging, but some are particularly damaging. So we need to do more to prevent all maltreatment, but some are really, really important. Sexual abuse, and emotional abuse are by far the most damaging for these worst outcomes. Okay, and emotional abuse is particularly devastating. We haven't had enough attention given to emotional abuse before. Now, we said in one of our articles that we need a new era in child maltreatment prevention. And we said there that we should all be shaken by these findings, and we should. These are real Australian children. They're kids in our streets, in our schools, in our communities. Many of these children experience terrible and frequent maltreatment with devastating consequences. But all these children matter. Every child matters. And these findings can be extrapolated right across the nation. Okay, we had a nationally representative sample. Clearly, our past record has not been good enough. The current situation is not acceptable. We must all do better. And yet, we are not without hope. I've given you some grim findings so far, but we're not without hope. We can do better, and in some areas we have done better. Change is possible. Let me give you some good news now. We have seen some extraordinary, historic changes. There has been a decline in physical abuse of children in Australia. For decades, our sample shows us, for decades, the rate of child physical abuse was about 35%, 1 in 3 kids. The younger participants from our survey, the 16 to 24-year-olds, their data shows us it's down to 28%. That's still way too high. That's 1 in 4 kids today. But that is a massive decline in the course of a generation. We need to continue that. Second bit of good news, sexual abuse by some types of offender has also declined. Let me give you one example. For decades in Australia, sexual abuse by parents and adult family members in the home was about 8.8%, 1 in 12. Shocking. But our youth sample aged 16 to 24, that rate is down to 4.4%. It has halved in a generation. When you consider just how many kids now are not experiencing sexual abuse by that class of offender in Australia that were previously, that is something that we should all be really proud of. The prevention efforts, the investment, the time, the work by people on the ground, people in communities to bring about that change, that is historic. That is great for Australia. That is historic for the world when we look at the big picture. So these extraordinary achievements show our efforts have been making a difference in these domains. Extraordinary achievements. There's no doubt that our financial investment and prevention efforts and their impact at the societal, community and individual level have influenced these declines. It's inspiring. We can really draw strength and hope from those trends. It shows that change is possible. So what should we do now to create further positive change? Let me just briefly emphasize just 8 things that we've recommended. The first and perhaps most important thing is that because child maltreatment is widespread and it's complex, it requires a nationally coordinated whole of government response that requires the Australian government to work closely and together over a sustained, enduring period of time. They all need to work together. Until now, we have been fragmented at the Australian government and state government level. They need to come together and work together. It's that simple. That joint coordinated approach needs to be embedded within our national governance architecture. There can be an Australian and state government interdisciplinary committee. We can have it as a standing priority issue for our national cabinet. We need an enduring commitment delivered through an enduring bipartisan public health policy priority with a comprehensive plan that moves beyond political cycles. It needs to be baked in forever. Australian governments have a moral, a social and an economic imperative to develop a coordinated long-term plan for generational reform. It's that simple. The second thing we need is to invest more and to invest better to accelerate a public health approach. This public health approach has to emphasise primary prevention. We need to prevent maltreatment before it even starts. We need to do that at the population level. We also need secondary prevention, so targeted work to those who require more support. Third, at the societal level, we need broad policy for social determinants. That is, we need to assist the broad social levers that can take off some of the strain, some of the stressors that influence child maltreatment. These are things like housing, tax policy, parental leave, and access to childcare. We need to make these social determinants as favourable as we can for all Australians. Fourth, we need new, developed, stronger social norms against violence against children and against gendered violence and inequality. Positive social norms can and do influence positive conduct. They have a trickle-down effect on national norms and behaviour. We need norms to condemn violence and instead promote strong, honourable, caring, loving behaviour. Fifth, we need much more community-level support, that is sectoral support, to assist practitioners when they respond to maltreatment, whether it's health, social services, education and other sectors. Practitioners deserve education, support and resources. Treatment services need massive investment, personnel and increased support services to provide treatment for those Australians who are grappling with the consequences of child maltreatment. Sixth, at the individual level, we need support for parents. This must be intensified at both prenatal and postnatal levels and through early childhood and key transitional points in adolescence. We need things like nurse home visiting programs and parenting education programs rolled out at scale. Two more things. These are important. We need an emotional revolution. Our results from the Australian Child Maltreatment Study show we need a paradigm shift in emotional abuse prevention and response. This must be a key priority through systematic policy reform and programs. Until now, we have not given anywhere near enough attention to the importance of emotional abuse. This is the next dimension. This is where we'll get biggest bang for our buck. This is where we'll achieve much greater outcomes for children, parents, families, and communities. And finally, we need a sexual and relational evolution. And that word relational is important. To reduce child sexual abuse, we don't just focus on sex, we focus on relationships. We need turbocharged prevention to reduce child sexual abuse, both by adults but also by adolescents. We have mapped an increase in sexual abuse by other adolescents. In recent years, we have made great gains in things like consent education and respectful relationships education, but that needs to be supplemented and underpinned by comprehensive, broad-based sexual relationships education in schools. That needs to develop sexual literacy, but also emotional literacy and relational literacy. This will reduce child sexual abuse if we choose to do it. In closing, I began today by challenging us to ask ourselves, who are we as a nation and what kind of country do we want to be? Our governments now have the information they need to better prevent child maltreatment and its often terrible outcomes. As we've travelled this country presenting our results, we have seen a yearning for this evidence from our Australian Child Maltreatment Study. And we've also seen a yearning for these kinds of policy developments and greater investment. We've seen this time and time again. We've seen it when speaking with multiple Australian and state government departments. We've seen it when speaking with sector leaders in health agencies and communities and families agencies. We've seen it with coal-face practitioners, the unsung heroes who every day work so hard to look after kids and families who need some help. We've seen it repeatedly talking with people in Canberra, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide, Darwin, East Arnhem Land, everywhere. This is what people have been crying up for. We know that change is possible, and we now know where change is required the most. We thank all those who have tirelessly worked to achieve the gains we've already made and acknowledge the enormous legacy you've already created. We now challenge and urge the governments of Australia, the leaders of this nation, to continue and intensify this work, to invest for the long term, to make this nation the best it can be, and most important of all, to stand with our kids and for our kids and give them the chance of life they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you to their Excellencies, the Governor-General, the Honourable David Hurley and Mrs. Linda Hurley. We really appreciate your ongoing support for NAPCAN and National Child Protection Week.
And thank you so much, Ben. This is such an important story, and it's a disturbing story, but it also tells us something inspiring, that child abuse can be prevented when we work together. I'm in awe of the way that you articulate the data and the findings in a way that we can all understand. Every time I hear you speak, I'm struck by the takeaway that we can't afford not to act. This now is the right time to act. The study provides a irrefutable evidence base for decision makers to act. Morally, socially, ethically and economically, the cost is just too high. Joining forces is the right thing to do. The ACMS study gives us information and data we need to place prevention at the national agenda in a really meaningful way. It has to be a national priority. I know from having conversations with many of the thinkers in the room, we're all on the same page around this.
Can I just jump in there, Lisa? I think this is a really important issue because I know that a lot of children and young people and their families in Australia are really struggling. But what is so different about this study, Lisa, when we already know that child maltreatment in Australia is such a big issue?
Good question, Ollie. I agree. We know that child maltreatment is a big issue, but governments and policymakers love data, and the findings represent an opportunity to have the relevant conversations with the right people. We've never had a study of this nature in the country, and the findings show us that children in Australia are doing it even tougher than we thought. As a nation, we're getting better at understanding that the data represents the lives of real children and families, and that many of them are struggling.
So it's clear to me that in Australia, every child in every community at the moment is not getting a fair go. But it sounds like the ACMS study has given us the launchpad we needed to unite on this issue.
Exactly. Like many in the room today, NAPCAN was surprised that there hasn't been more action on a way forward following the release of these findings. We want to build on the work that's already been done, including existing initiatives, but see stronger national action, because there are many successful initiatives, but they lack coordination on prevention. Thanks to many of you and your thought leadership in this space over many years, it was agreed that National Child Protection Week was a great opportunity to talk about how we can do things differently. Given that the theme of National Child Protection Week is where we start matters, we think that we need to start with bringing diverse perspectives together to discuss solutions. NAPCAN and partners are calling on the Commonwealth Government to host a national summit to prevent child maltreatment. We're hoping that this summit could represent a catalyst for change and a fresh way of doing things.
Okay, that was a lot, Lisa, and I'm just trying to wrap my head around this. So this summit would be an opportunity for all the people in the sector or even the community to come together to build a common understanding about and talk openly about what is working and what's not. The thing is, how do we make sure that the right people are involved? We know all too often that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been removed from their homes and their families and continue to be overrepresented in the child protection system. So without the voices of young First Nations peoples, this summit would be pointless, right?
Absolutely. The summit needs to be an opportunity to hear directly from a range of unique and real voices, those who we don't always hear from, and along with the leaders and the experts, so we can begin to understand why there's a disconnect and weave our knowledge together to create a better Australia now and into the future. It's important to recognise the wonderful work in this space, such as Snake and other partners who are working hard to shift this story. We must elevate the voice of First Nation Australians, particularly of the children and young people, and hear directly from them about what will work.
Yes, I agree. This is a great opportunity to ensure that the relevant voices are heard, because the one common standing denominator amongst all of these issues of maltreatment is the children. So I would say it's about time that we as the sector involve young people and individuals' experiences and ask them, the young people, instead, what we need to do to ensure they are kept safe, stay safe, and then use that information to make effective change, similar to what Ben has done. But whilst all of this sounds like a great way forward, Lisa, I'm aware that there is so many loads of national plans and frameworks already, right?
Yeah, there's lots of national plans and frameworks out there, but they don't align. That is actually one of the things that we need to shift. At the moment, we're all going to the government, telling them our piece of the puzzle, but what if we all just sat down in the same room with the same focus? We have been doing great work across Australia, but working in silos is not going to help us connect the jigsaw pieces of the wellbeing puzzle for children and their families. We have to start somewhere, and this is why the summit call to action by NatCan is so important.
Yeah, that's a great point there, Lisa. We do have to start somewhere. Someone once said to me in reference to youth justice alternatives, well, we won't see any change for at least a generation, so what's the point? To which I responded, well, it's better than no change at all, so we best get started now. It's really important that we create the common understanding in all of these plans about why prevention has to be the 101 of any framework or plan. Sorry for my uni language.
Exactly. Until things change, 6 in 10 of us will continue to experience a form of maltreatment. We have to be bold and we have to be brave and we have to put ourselves in the shoes of children. If we're feeling moved by the stories that we hear, then imagine what it's like for the children. I have seen the faces and the trauma of the many children and the families that this data represents, and I know that we have to do something differently. So let's start with sitting together and listening deeply to each other and then come up with a plan on a way forward.
I agree. The goal must be to ensure that many children in Australia grow up loved, safe and well within their families. We owe it to the babies, children and teens and their families who need our support. We owe it to those who work with children and families and are struggling to meet their needs. We also owe it to us as taxpayers who know that there are better ways to fix our social problems. The outcomes from this summit could influence a prevention strategy that has shared accountability across all levels of government.
Exactly, Ollie. We need everyone to get behind this call to action in whatever way they can. You can jump onto NatCan's website for more details on how you can get involved, because every child deserves to feel loved and safe. The issue of child abuse and maltreatment goes to the heart of who we are as a nation and what we will become. So thank you for joining us either in person or online today and kicking off our week and having these meaningful conversations. Don't forget to join the webinars throughout the week. I also want to thank their Excellencies for hosting this event. And before we finish, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to NatCan's Deputy CEO, Rani Kumar, whose passion and insight has been fundamental in coordinating NatCan's call to action for the summit today. And I'll leave you with this thought. Australians' children need us to get this right. Thank you.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude formalities this morning. Please join the Governor-General, Mrs. Hurley, out on the croquet lawn for morning tea. Thank you.